democracy, civil society, and regional stability. Can you expand on that a bit? And in so doing, what can we do? What can we, the United States, do to motivate our foreign partners to be better partners and more effective partners in tracking down on TCO activity?
Thank you. I think it's a challenging environment because we are now facing numerous governments that have, for example, the government of Argentina, which has declared itself as Russia's doorway to Latin America and has allowed China to come with nuclear programs, deep space stations, et cetera. So I think that there is more constrained space to operate with trusted partners. I think at the same time, the vast majority of folks in the military and in the law enforcement community prefer the United States as their first partner of choice. And I think that if you look at, and we mapped this out for Southcom and others over time, the level of high-level visits by the Russian and Chinese is about 17 times the level of U.S. visits to Latin America. And I think what I told them at the time, if Russia can find the time in the middle of a war to send its foreign minister around, we should be able to do a little better. We have a huge disadvantage with Russia in that they have a small cadre of highly experienced ambassadors that rotate around the region, speak Spanish, or on Twitter all the time. We have major embassies sitting without ambassadors for, in the case of Chile, almost 3 years. Now we're going into Colombia, we're going into the second year. So I think that there are multiple relatively easy fixes to that engagement. And I think we also need to do a better job of helping to explain the threats to their own democracies and rule of law that the Russian and Chinese involvement bring, because they're directly tied to massive corruption and massive destruction of their own institutions.
Thank you. And Mr. Blazakis.
Terrorist threats facing our nation. But he comes to the Hill twice in the last week to appear before the Judiciary Committee and here today to engage in political gamesmanship. Perhaps Mr. Wolf is also trying to distract from his abysmal tenure at DHS, a tenure that included the department's intentionally taking children from their parents at the border, changing and delaying a report on Russian interference in the 2020 election, and misusing DHS personnel to crack down on peaceful protesters in Portland. As it turns out, he was even serving unlawfully as acting secretary, having been appointed outside the department's succession orders. In fact, Mr. Wolf was the 5th person to run DHS and the 2nd to do so unlawfully in less than 3 years under President Trump, a stark reminder of the chaos and dysfunction of that administration. I expect that today's Republicans will try to rewrite the history of the Trump administration and its border security and immigration policies. But the truth is, under the last administration, DHS took children from their parents, forced individuals fleeing violence and persecution to wait in Mexico, and expelled unaccompanied children at our border. The truth is, the last administration dismantled our lawful immigration system to the point where it could barely function. The policies were not only terribly cruel, but also incredibly ineffective. They didn't address fundamental border security challenges, fix our broken immigration system, or respond to the ongoing global migration phenomenon. Instead, they made the problem worse. For example, the number of encounters at the border jumped sharply after President Trump implemented Title 42, and they made vulnerable people suffer. That is the mess the Biden administration inherited, and that is what Secretary Mayorkas has had to deal with since taking office. Mr. Chairman, legitimate oversight follows the facts, and the facts is that the Biden administration's plan to address these challenges are working. The number of Border Patrol encounters have plummeted by 70% since the Biden administration ended Title 42 last month. The number of overall border encounters have dropped by 50% in that time, due in large part to DHS's hard work under Secretary Mayorkas' leadership. The Biden administration has reestablished lawful pathways for migrants to access the asylum system. It has also utilized parole on a case-by-case basis for those fleeing certain totalitarian or communist regimes in our hemisphere. At the same time, it has made clear that our borders are not open and those arriving outside lawful pathways will be sent home. Recent deportation and removal numbers reflect that hard reality for many. Unlike its predecessor, the Biden administration is enforcing border and immigration laws in an orderly, humane way, consistent with precedents set by prior administrations of both parties. Some may not like that, but those are policy differences and nothing more. You don't impeach a cabinet secretary because you don't like their policies, and you certainly don't impeach a cabinet secretary to appease extreme members of your political party. Secretary Mayorkas is fulfilling his duty under the law and to the American people. If the Republican majority doesn't like what he's doing, they should work with Democrats to pass bipartisan border security and immigration reform legislation. Apparently, they prefer political theater and sloppy, inaccurate, quote, unquote, report instead. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted to the record, and I'd like, without objection, to enter into the record the DHS order of secession, which shows that Mr. Wolf had the authority to serve as Secretary. Without objection, so ordered. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this overdue discussion. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. You're done. Okay. I'd like to now formally introduce the witnesses. Mr. Chad Wolf serves as America First Policy Institute's Executive Director, Chief Strategy Officer, and the Chair for the Center of Homeland Security and Immigration. Prior to joining AFPI, Mr. Wolf was the former Acting Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. During his time at DHS, he successfully navigated numerous global and domestic challenges to the nation's security, including COVID-19, civil unrest, numerous border and immigration crises, historic natural disasters, and threats to global aviation security. Prior to his service as DHS, he spent over 10 years in the private sector, helping clients manage risks, and before that worked here on Capitol Hill. He has received the U.S. Secretary of Transportation 911 Medal, the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Distinguished Service Medal, and the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. Mr. Joe Edlow has an extensive distinguished background in immigration policy. He most recently served as Acting Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Prior to that position, he served as the Chief Counsel for USCIS. Before his time at USCIS, Mr. Edlow worked on immigration issues in various capacities under the Trump administration, including with the Executive Office of the President and the Justice Department's Office of Legal Policy. He served from 2008 to 2015 as Assistant Chief Counsel for the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He possesses significant experience on Capitol Hill as well, including stints with the House Judiciary Committee and former Representative Raul Labrador of Idaho. Mr. Rodney Scott is a law enforcement officer and the former chief of the United States Border Patrol, where he served from January 2020 to August 2021, under both President Trump and President Biden. Scott has served in the Border Patrol and CBP since 1992. Throughout his career, Mr. Scott held roles such as Assistant Chief in CBP's Office of Anti-Terrorism in Washington, D.C., as well as the Division Chief and Director for the Incident Management and Operations Coordination Division at CBP headquarters. Ms. Eleanor Acer is a Senior Director for Refugee Protection at Human Rights First, where she oversees Human Rights First's research and advocacy on issues relating to refugee protection, asylum, and the human rights of migrants. Ms. Acer served on the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration as the Vice Chair of the Refugee Council, USA, from 2006 to 2008, and currently serves on its board. Ms. Acer received her JD from Fordham University School of Law and her BA in History from Brown University. I thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I now recognize Mr. Wolf for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Representative Thompson, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. By any objective measure or metric, the U.S. is facing the worst humanitarian and national security crisis along our southern border in our nation's history. Today's border security system is unrecognizable from the America First policies of the Trump administration or even those in place during previous administrations. In all candor, this is the first administration of either political party to deliberately take steps to diminish the security along our southern border. Here's the situation along the border today. This country has experienced the largest mass-scale catch-and-release policy that has resulted in more than 4.5 million illegal aliens, including 1.5 million known gotaways, being allowed into American communities. That is a population larger than every major U.S. city except for New York City. There have been more than 200 known or suspected terrorists apprehended at the southern border, compared to just 11 during the Trump administration. The border is effectively controlled by the Mexican cartels. Fentanyl is coming across the border in record amounts and is the leading cause of death of young Americans. More migrants have died during their journey than ever before. 380,000 children and counting have been trafficked or smuggled across the southern border and abused physically, mentally, and in some cases sexually along the horrendous journey. In the last 2 years, this administration has lost contact with more than 85,000 children after releasing them to sponsors, many of them unvetted, and tens of thousands of children have been subjected to indentured servitude and harsh forced labor situations. And lastly, we are seeing a concerted effort to facilitate illegal aliens into the country at ports of entry through an unlawful parole program and a CBP-1 app to disguise or otherwise hide the extent of the crisis from the American people. I understand the difficulty and complexity of running the Department of Homeland Security, but it is clear to me and to millions of Americans that this is a crisis by design and one that was avoidable. I'm here today as a veteran of DHS, having served at the department in 2 presidential administrations spanning over 7 years, holding 8 senior-level positions that culminated in serving as the acting secretary, but perhaps most importantly, earning the respect of the department's law enforcement officials along the way. And while I look forward to today's discussion, as you have already heard, some members will choose to attack me because I am critical of the administration's actions surrounding this crisis. This is what you will likely hear. This is what you have heard. They will claim I ignored a subpoena to appear before this committee in 2020. What they have failed to provide you is the relevant context that I gave this committee over 2 months of dates for that hearing and for my availability, and that a hearing was never scheduled, or that it would have been improper for me to testify after President Trump nominated me to be DHS Secretary. They will attack me because of questions surrounding the department's order of succession and how it affected my role as acting secretary, a role that I am very proud of. To the extent they mention policies, they will fixate over a short-lived zero tolerance from 5 years ago while staying completely silent about the historic and ongoing migrant child trafficking crisis facilitated by this administration. The reason we see a border in crisis and chaos is simple. The Biden administration has dismantled all of the proven and effective policies put in place under the last administration. That includes well-known policies like the Remain in Mexico and the asylum cooperative agreements with the Northern Triangle. But it also includes more than 24 lesser-known but effective policies, such as a third country transit asylum bar, a humanitarian asylum review process, a prompt asylum claim review, a regulation to end fake families and the cruel recycling of migrant children, having Border Patrol agents conduct credible fear screenings, internal relocation guidance, expedited removal, ending nationwide catch and release, maxing out ICE detention capacity, and exceeding annual deportation targets. And the list goes on. And every one of those have been torn down. By comparison, this administration has embraced ineffective and unlawful policies that have made American communities dangerous and have enriched the Mexican cartels. These policies include a nationwide catch and release scheme that incentivizes millions and millions of other illegal aliens to enter illegally, a 100-day deportation freeze for all illegal aliens, including criminals, releasing illegal aliens on an honor system to self-report to ICE field offices, exempting 99% of illegal aliens from deportation, the lowest level of ICE detention capacity, the lowest deportations in modern history, terminating Remain in Mexico, and fully exempting children from Title 42. This is dangerous, and this is an inhumane approach that need not occur. The laws did not change between administrations, just the decision by this one not to follow the laws. For the reasons cited here and others I'm happy to discuss, it is my professional opinion that this administration is derelict in its duty to faithfully execute the laws as written and protect American communities. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
I now recognize Mr. Edlow for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to present testimony today regarding the continuing threats to the integrity of our immigration system caused by the Secretary and the Department of Homeland Security's willful disregard of our country's immigration laws. The Biden administration, through the Secretary, has seen fit to ignore the law, instead favoring poorly conceived and poorly executed policy decisions. Actions through executive orders, departmental memos, and rules lay waste to the INA and congressional intent. It has eroded our immigration system and propelled the crisis to current levels. As the chairman said, Section 102 of the INA charges the Secretary of Homeland Security with administration and enforcement of the act, and further vests in the Secretary the power and duty to control and guard the boundaries and borders of the United States against the illegal entry of aliens. The massive number of encounters recorded by CBP and the small number of alien removals by ICE, however, suggest that this Secretary has failed to faithfully execute the laws entrusted to him. Since day one of the administration, the department has taken aggressive action to undermine immigration enforcement. Nowhere is that clearer than Secretary Mayorkas' September 30th, 2021 memorandum outlining the appropriate instances in which DHS was authorized to take action against aliens either unlawfully present or lawfully present but removable. Specifically, Secretary Mayorkas outlined 3 main buckets for removal: threats to national security, threats to public safety, and threats to border security. While in theory this would seem to encompass many aliens, in reality the numerous carve-outs, loose definitions, and required factors for consideration made it nearly impossible for ICE to move forward with most enforcement actions. These poorly defined categories gave even some of the most serious of criminal aliens a free pass in the interest of equity. Let me be clear, there is a time and a place for prosecutorial discretion, which has been recognized by the Supreme Court. However, memos targeted at whole groups and not on a case-by-case basis do not comply with the contours of such discretion. Categorical prosecutorial discretion is not discretion at all. It is instead an effort to undermine the enforcement mechanisms clearly found in the law. The department's failure to enforce the full INA in the name of prioritization and discretion is a dereliction of duty. The rampant parole abuse that we now witness is exactly why Congress saw fit to change the law in 1996. Replacing emergent reasons or for reasons deemed strictly in the public interest with on a case-by-case basis for humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit, Congress signaled its intention to clamp down on the process. It specifically wanted to guard against ad hoc programs meant to supplement existing immigration programs. Regardless of the plain language as it currently stands, parole has become a favorite tool of the administration. While first used as an alternative to detention, parole programs have subsequently played a large role in artificially decreasing border numbers. The expanded categorical parole programs for nationals of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Haiti are wholly unlawful. While certainly the previous administration utilized programs, the number of parolees were a small fraction compared to what we have seen on a monthly basis over the past 2.5 years. I would be remiss if I did not mention the department's regulatory agenda, which seeks to upend the credible fear process in the name of orderly processing. Starting with the presumption that every economic migrant is entitled to protection, in 2022, DHS issued an interim final rule on credible fear screening. Under the new process, a positive credible fear determination by an asylum officer will lead to a non-adversarial asylum interview before another DHS asylum officer. This impermissibly changes the process and undermines congressional action by shifting adjudication authority from DOJ to DHS. Even more concerning, written summary of the original credible fear interview now doubles as an alien's asylum application, rendering moot the requirement that an alien file one at all. This shifts the burden to present and prepare a meritorious claim for protection. While this does not ensure an asylum grant, it certainly provides a path for fraud and renders certain anti-asylum fraud measures moot. A second final rule issued last month appears to be tough on illegal border crossers, making them ineligible for asylum. However, the number of exceptions and the easily rebuttable presumptions belie its stated purpose. This rule will have the opposite effect, as it will ultimately incentivize aliens to make the dangerous trek northward with families in tow. Mr. Chairman, we would not be sitting here today if the Secretary and the Department simply enforced the law as written. Instead, the Department has, in an effort to remove barriers and to create a subjectively orderly system, conflated law and policy and ensured that when the two were in conflict, that policy won the day. A return to the rule of law is the only cure at this point, and it is incumbent upon Congress to use its oversight and lawmaking authority to repair the damage done by the Department. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Edlow. I now recognize Mr. Scott for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee, thank you for letting me testify here today. The career professionals at DHS, and specifically Customs and Border Protection and U.S. Border Patrol, deserve our praise and admiration. I am confident that they are doing everything they can every day to protect this country, despite this administration's efforts to undermine their efforts. The chaos at our southwest border and the consequences are a result of actions taken by the Biden administration. The perspectives that I provide are grounded in my professional experience, including my time as chief in the Biden administration. Decades of bipartisan border security improvements were erased on January 20th, 2021, when the Biden administration announced actions that were heard around the world as the U.S. borders are now open. As predicted, the most secure border the U.S. had ever enjoyed disintegrated into chaos. The Biden administration's claims that they inherited a border in shambles, that surges in illegal immigration like this are normal, or that allowing more illegal aliens to go through a port of entry is solving the problem, are not accurate. The crisis at our border is still raging. Don't get lulled into believing that 3,500 arrests a day should be cheered just because it is lower than the 11,000 a day we saw a few weeks ago. The Border Patrol remains overwhelmed. The cartels continue to control who and what is entering the United States. Migrants are still being exploited, and children are still being trafficked. CBP has recorded over 6 million encounters and over 1.4 million known gotaways. That's under the Biden administration. But numbers fail to convey the severity of the national security consequences. Some consequences are easier to measure than others before a bomb goes off. The 1.4 million known gotaways are a measurable consequence of agents being overwhelmed. But consider that hundreds of miles of border lack any persistent surveillance. And when construction of the border wall system was terminated, the associated technology was also terminated. Every minute that agents are not patrolling the U.S. border increases the probability of more unknown gotaways. Most illicit narcotics, including the fentanyl that is readily available in your hometown, originated outside of the United States. Every agent and officer taken away from inspection and patrol duties decreases our nation's ability to interdict these poisons before they can hurt your family, your friends, and your neighbors. Leaving hundreds of miles of border unmanned and unpatrolled is like leaving the doors of your home open when you go on vacation. You can replace things that get stolen, but the real threat is the unknown person hiding in your home when you return. Verifying any unknown person's identity or their story requires a face-to-face conversation. How many human trafficking incidents went undetected because our law enforcement personnel today are being instructed to process aliens like a fast food drive-through? How do we quantify the intelligence collection opportunities that were lost? Additionally, when CBP officers are redirected to conduct immigration processing, legal trade and travel suffers. This further disrupts our supply chain, increases the cost of imported goods, and more. As Chief of the United States Border Patrol, my staff and I engaged and advised the Biden transition teams well before inauguration. The administration's laser focus on expediting processing and increasing opportunities for migrants to enter the U.S. never wavered. Advice from career professionals was ignored. Policies were implemented that resulted in thousands of aliens being released into the U.S. Illegal immigration intensified, overwhelmed Border Patrol, and effectively transferred control of our southwest border directly to the Mexican drug cartels. This is a national security threat. Cartels use illegal aliens to overwhelm law enforcement, creating controllable gaps in border security. These gaps are exploited to smuggle anything they want into the United States. To think that terrorist networks and hostile nations are not exploiting this vulnerability is naive. I'm not here testifying about policy differences. Policy is how you carry out your duties under the law. The Secretary of Homeland Security has a legal duty to prevent the illegal entry of aliens and to secure our border. Even if success is unattainable, he still needs to try. Instead, Secretary Mayorkas has chosen to expend department resources to provide care for aliens that enter the U.S. illegally. As detailed in my written testimony, I believe the Secretary is derelict in his duties to secure the border, and I also believe that the Secretary has likely violated the Impoundment Control Act. Secretary Mayorkas is great at invoking understandable compassion for the plight of the migrants, and I too acknowledge our humanitarian responsibilities. But as Secretary of the United States Department of Homeland Security and the overseer of billions of tax dollars that are appropriated to protect America, if you look at that, this administration is clearly not doing their job.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I now recognize Ms. Acer for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. Over the last few years, Human Rights First has documented the horrific harms inflicted on people due to the Remain in Mexico and Title 42 policies. I personally witnessed the first days of the implementation of Remain in Mexico from Tijuana under the Trump administration, and the final days of the Title 42 policy from Matamoros and Reynosa last month. My testimony focuses on a few key areas. First, our laws and treaties rightly allow people seeking protection from persecution to seek asylum, and asylum is both morally just and politically popular. Second, not only did Trump administration policies like Remain in Mexico and Title 42 evade and violate refugee law, but they spurred chaos and inflicted massive human suffering. Third, the Biden administration should swiftly end its asylum ban, which endangers the lives of refugees and is inconsistent with the law, as were the Trump administration's bans on asylum. Fourth, as Human Rights First's experts on extremism and anti-Semitism have detailed, rhetoric painting migrants and asylum seekers as threats or invaders fuels white supremacist conspiracy theories and violence. It must be countered. Finally, Congress and the Biden administration should work together to implement effective strategies and provide the necessary resources to address challenges at the border and properly staff safe, effective, fair asylum adjudications. The crisis we're facing is a humanitarian one, and it's global. In my written testimony, I outlined the ways in which human rights situations have deteriorated in countries in the Americas, including Cuba, Guatemala, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, pushing people to flee in search of protection, safety, and stability. The reality is that the vast majority of the world's refugees are hosted by other countries. And here in the Americas, other countries are hosting refugees as well. 6 million of the 7 million Venezuelans who have fled are hosted in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States is more than capable of humanely receiving and fairly processing the claims of people seeking refuge here. Under the Trump administration, Human Rights First tracked 1,544 reports of kidnappings, murder, torture, rape, and other violent attacks against people returned to Mexico under MPP. And during the court-ordered re-implementation of MPP in 2022, asylum seekers continued to be targeted. MPP hearings remained a due process farce. Many asylum seekers were abducted while traveling through border regions to attend hearings or directly outside U.S. ports of entry before or after their hearings. MPP also wasted government resources. DHS's analysis concluded it diverted resources from other migration priorities. In June 2020, the Supreme Court confirmed the DHS secretary had authority to end the policy. Asylum seekers and migrants returned to Mexico under Title 42 similarly suffered kidnappings, rapes, and other attacks. The Trump administration returned well-known political activists from Nicaragua directly back to their country of persecution. Human Rights First has tracked over 13,480 reports of kidnappings, torture, and other attacks against asylum seekers and migrants during the Biden administration. Moreover, far from being an effective border management tool, the policy actually spurred increased crossings between ports of entry, inflated border apprehension statistics, and exacerbated cartel violence. Ending Title 42 does not mean that the U.S. border is open. It means U.S. immigration and refugee law can no longer be evaded by specious invocation of public health authority. The Biden administration has taken important steps towards expanding refugee resettlement from the Americas and some regular pathways to the U.S. through parole. As outlined in my testimony, the Department of Homeland Security has authority, legal authority, to parole individuals into the country and legal authority to release people from detention. The use of these legal authorities do not mean the border is open. In conclusion, the Biden administration and Congress should work together to uphold refugee law at U.S. borders. Maximizing asylum at ports of entry after years of blockage is essential to end the counterproductive consequences of Trump policies that restricted and blocked access to asylum at ports of entry and pushed populations to cross between. We should enhance support for refugee hosting capacities in other countries, support for strong asylum systems and reception capacities, ramp up, speed up, and strengthen regional resettlement, improve parole and other safe migration policies, implement humanitarian rather than punitive approaches to refugee protection, and take other steps that I've outlined in detail in my testimony. We also need to press the Biden administration to end its asylum ban and to stop subjecting asylum seekers to fast-track processing in CBP custody, as the Trump administration did. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony, and I now recognize myself for questions. I want to talk about this claim that there's been a 70% decrease, since Title 42 went away. And it looks like they're counting the encounters at 3,500 compared to the peak of 11,000, the actual record number, which happened right before that. But what they're not counting, it's very interesting, I don't know any of the witnesses that can confirm this, but that we're not counting the CBP-1 app appointments, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That is correct. So the numbers that are being cited by the department are Border Patrol numbers. Those are encounters between ports of entry. So they talk about, I believe, a 70% decrease. What they're not telling you, they're actually capturing the number, but they're not including it in their press release, is the number from OFO, which is the Office of Field Operations. They're at a port of entry, are the number of inadmissibles that are showing up at ports of entry. And what's happening is they're being shifted between the ports of entry to the ports of entry.
It's a shell game, basically. We're taking the numbers out of these and we're not reporting them over here, and we're allowing for appointments to be made through CBP-1 app, and then saying that that's a lawful mechanism of entry. Mr. Edlow, is that in congruence with the law? Is that a lawful entry just because you fill out an app online?
No, it's not.
So it's a violation of the law.
It's a violation, and frankly, if somebody comes to the port of entry, has no documentation to get in, there is a lawful mechanism for them to claim credible fear and to move through that process, but to just allow them to come in, to parole them, not on a case-by-case basis, I might add, but as a group, is not within the confines of the law.
It's against the laws passed by the United States Congress. Okay, so again, kind of digging into this a little further, this group of, and I think the amount of the appointments are about 1,500 or so a day. Add that to the 3,500, add that to the number that don't schedule an appointment and come through, that we don't know that number because they're not reporting that number. Has there really been an appreciable decrease, in your opinions, since the beginning, since Title 42 went away?
I do not believe that there has been a decrease in the numbers. It is a shell game. And the other thing I want to point out too is it's very selective about what day they choose to compare the numbers to. You need to look at a little broader amount of time. The border for my entire career was systematically getting more and more controlled, and we are actually driving those numbers down. You have to look at it longer, not just one day in time.
Mr. Wolf, on May 10th, reporter and immigration analyst Todd Benzman reported ahead of the expiration of Title 42 that Mexican immigration officials were informing him that they were coordinating with DHS personnel on the other side of the border to move illegal aliens from the Mexico side of the Rio Grande to the American side. In other words, they were helping aliens illegally cross into the United States. This would violate, as I understand it, Section 274 of the INA, which prohibits aiding and abetting illegal immigration or helping someone enter the country. In your opinion, would such an intentional coordination on a high-profile stage have been conducted without the approval or foreknowledge of the Secretary of Homeland Security?
No, you would need to have approval up and down the chain of command.
So basically, again, violating the laws of the United States, you think that authority, I mean, the Border Patrol guys would never do that without the authority of the Secretary. Is that what you're saying?
It's hard for me to say whether the chief of the Border Patrol was aware, or whether that made it all the way to the Secretary or not. I'm not there, so I can't testify to that.
I can't imagine they'd willfully break the law without the Secretary giving them approval, but that we'll dig further into that later. The interim final rule that came out, Mr. Edlow, can you discuss a little bit about how this basically upends the entire intent of the laws of Congress from the INA?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. When the Homeland Security Act was signed and enacted in 2002, 2003, most powers that had been exercised by the former INS were moved over to the new DHS, specifically with asylum to USCIS, where asylum officers were conducting interviews. However, after a credible fear interview, the way it always had worked was that the alien would then go before the immigration judge. That powers were never transferred as part of the Homeland Security Act. This rule does shift that authority from DOJ to DHS having a second bite at the apple to have
Speed people into the country, basically, not have to go through the immigration judge process.
But not only that, sir, but the fact that they do not require a new asylum application really does limit the ability for anyone to assess whether there's a valid claim or not.
My time has expired. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Asa, Republicans have constantly falsely accused Secretary Mayorkas of being derelict in his duty to secure the border, even though, as I said in my opening statement, border encounters have dropped sharply since the Biden administration terminated Title 42 last month. Republicans don't like the Biden administration is returning to a more orderly, humane border and immigration policy after the cruelty and dysfunction of the Trump administration. And they can't stand that these policies have been effective. So we are seeing this political theater play out with the Republican leadership trying desperately to appease its members. My Republican colleagues seem to be particularly upset about the Biden administration allowing people to present themselves at port of entry to seek asylum as provided under the law, just as every other administration had prior to this one. Actually, there seems to be some revisionist history going on because even President Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, Mr. Wolf's former boss, acknowledged, in fact, encouraged migrants to come to ports of entry for processing, saying, and I quote, "So if a migrant comes to a port of entry, they haven't broken any laws." This is exactly why we tried to encourage the migrants to go to a port of entry. The Biden administration is being sued to force it to do more to restore access to asylum after the last administrations effectively cut it off. Now, Ms. Asa, since you are an immigration attorney with vast experience and expertise in this field, I want to talk with you and set the record straight. Claiming asylum at a port of entry is lawful, correct?
Absolutely.
Claiming asylum after being encountered by Border Patrol is lawful too, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Paroling migrants is lawful and within the authority of the Secretary of Homeland Security, correct?
Yes, sir.
No administration has ever detained everyone encountered at the border, isn't that right?
That is right.
And that includes the Trump administration, correct?
Absolutely.
So Title 42 caused terrible harm to asylum seekers, which you saw firsthand on your visits to the border. Title 42 was also detrimental to border security, isn't that right?
Absolutely.
Please explain that to the committee.
As I mentioned in my testimony, Title 42 encouraged repeat entries. It did not have immigration consequences. It also pushed populations that used to go and seek asylum at ports of entry to end up having to cross between ports of entry, because not just for weeks, but for months and months and years, there was no way to actually cross the border. The change in numbers we've seen, I believe, is a confirmation of what an absolute disaster Title 42 was from so many ways. Asylum seekers that we met at the border were trying to use the CBP-1 app. And how that works, for those of you who haven't seen it, is people provide information that the government receives and actually reviews in advance. One of our concerns about the CBP-1 app is that it could be used to actually meter and limit the number of asylum seekers allowed to legally seek asylum. In addition, I would say that, we're also concerned about asylum seekers who are trying to approach ports of entry who are not being allowed to do so now, either because of CBP or Mexican government authorities not letting them do so.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'd like to include in the record a GAO decision that Mr. Wolf indeed served in that capacity of secretary illegally. I'd like to also include a review requested by the department and affirmed by GAO again that Mr. Wolf served in that capacity illegally. I'd also like to submit for the record a fellow judge in Maryland also ruled that Mr. Wolf was serving illegally in that position.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
We have an objection.
I object. I don't believe the ranking member was capable of presenting to this committee justification for claiming that Secretary Wolf served illegally. This is not a court of law, it's a committee in Congress. I object to the inclusion in the historical record.
Okay, I think we misunderstood the gentleman's motion. It was not objection to the insertion of the material into the record. It was, I think, just a statement of opinion about. And so ordered. The GAO reports are entered into the record. I now recognize Mr. McCall from Texas, Chairman McCall from Texas, for his 5 minutes question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I served as chairman of this committee for 3 terms now, Foreign Affairs Committee, and Mr. Edlow, good to see you. We worked together on these issues, and Secretary Wolf, Mr. Scott, great state of Texas. And I was a federal prosecutor charged with prosecutions at the border. Political asylum is always the magnet, and it has been abused by the cartels for many years. 85% of these claims are not legit, only 15% are. It's very simple. When they're allowed to enter the United States, because we don't have detention space, they are released into our society. They're given a notice to appear, and they disappear. And I've seen this for 20 years in Congress. In fact, my first bill was to end, catch, and release, and here we are today with the same program. The Trump administration, through Secretary Wolf, Mr. Edlow, implemented what I thought was a very effective plan called the Migrant Protection Protocols, remain in Mexico. Because they had to remain in Mexico pending their adjudication. If it was legitimate, they were allowed in. If not, they were not allowed into the country. And it brought the numbers down dramatically. So what happened with the Biden administration gets into power? Nearly on day one, Secretary Mayorkas rescinds the order, rescinds migrant protection protocols, remain in Mexico. And what has happened since then? Nearly 100,000 young people died in this country due to fentanyls. Enough has been seized to kill billions of people, 5 million encounters, nearly 100 on the terror watch list, which used to frighten me as chairman of this committee when I would hear of anybody on the terrorist watch list getting into the United States of America. There was a court order to force the administration to re-implement MPP. That court order, in my view, has not been fully complied with by this administration. To make things worse, they took the vetting process away from sponsors of these aliens. What has that turned into? Children going to houses, 20, 30 of them, under one sponsor, not vetted, turns into a human trafficking enterprise, a criminal enterprise. Young girls being sex trafficked and young men going to MS-13 as they try to pay back the cartels. Cartels now are in operation control. When I was down at the border after the rescission of MPP, I asked the Chief of Border Patrol, Mr. Ortiz, is there a direct cause and effect between the rescission of this program and what we're seeing at the border, totally out of chaos? He told me the answer was yes. And every Border Patrol officer will tell you that because they live it. In my state, Mr. Scott, as you know, has spent $4.5 billion just this session to deal with this problem, a federal responsibility. So my question is, do you believe, Mr. Wolf, Mr. Scott, Mr. Edlow, that Secretary Mayorkas is responsible for the consequences that followed of the rescission of MPP? And do you believe he is complicit with the consequences of what has happened to this country?
So the answer to that is a resounding yes. Obviously, the Secretary ended MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols, so he's responsible for the actions that follow that. And I would just say, look, at the end of the day, it's okay to claim asylum. What's not okay is to simply be released into the country. Or it's not okay to say that there's an immense amount of fraud in the asylum system. DHS knows that. They have the numbers. We all use the numbers that come from DHS, but they simply put blinders on and say, we're okay with that amount of fraud. It's okay for the American people. That's why we implemented MPP, and we did a number of other things. They're not doing any of that now. So all of the folks that are claiming asylum at ports of entry, again, are being released into American communities. That's not okay.
I agree. Mr. Scott, Mr. Edlow.
I agree fully, and I want to point out, MPP made sure people got due process, but they did not get what they want. Most of these people, from my experience, don't really care about asylum. They don't really care about the legal documentation or process. They want to be released into the United States. Once that was taken away, the flow immediately decreased because they couldn't commit fraud. Everybody knew that. This administration got rid of that program intentionally. They're responsible for the results.
Mr. Edlow.
I also agree, and there's plenty I could say about MPP in terms of where it comes from, in terms of the INA, but I will just say this. When the court initially told the secretary to reinstitute MPP, there was an attempt to do that, a half-hearted attempt to do that, but in the press release that did that, it also made it clear that the secretary had every intention to fight that decision from the court and to take measures to end MPP in other ways. So it was really never an actual attempt to reinstate it.
The gentleman's time has expired. I recognize Mr. Correa of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start out by submitting for the record, without objection, the press release mentioned by Chairman Green, if I may, where it says that there were 10,070 non-citizens processed on an average per day via the CBP One app. I'd like to submit this for record, sir, without objection. Ms. Acer, does that sound like hiding the data?
No, it's not hiding the data.
I want to show you a quote by Secretary Nielsen, if I may. So we prefer, Mr. Wolf, we prefer people showing up at ports of entry as opposed to between ports of entry? Yes, no?
Absolutely, and I would
Thank
say
you
that that
very-
is accurate. What I would say is that the migrants
you,
are not
thank
breaking
you.
the law.
Thank you very much.
DHS is breaking the law with the parole
You got other
program.
people you can address here, but I just have 3 minutes left. Ms. Acer, is it legal to come to ports of entry?
Absolutely.
I want to show you a couple of pictures here of the refugee challenge we have in the Western Hemisphere. Tell you, the U.S. is not number one. You've got other countries that have it even worse than we do right now, trying to address this human challenge the world is facing. I'm going to show you also a picture of the Darien Gap and a young girl who's separated from her mother. She's not coming to Disneyland. She's trying to survive. Ms. Acer, let me ask you, did Secretary Mayorkas create the COVID-19 pandemic?
No, sir.
Is he responsible for the unprecedented violence, gang violence, extortions, assaults in Central America?
No, sir.
How about for the ongoing crisis in Haiti?
No.
The economic instability in Venezuela?
No.
Human rights violations in Cuba?
Absolutely not.
Responsible for repression, poverty in Nicaragua?
No.
Instability in Peru?
Nope.
Central American economic crisis?
No, sir.
China's economic challenges?
Absolutely not.
Russian-Ukrainian war and the ensuing refugees from Ukraine and Russia?
No, sir.
African economic instability and food shortages?
No.
America's stunning economic growth, strongest in the world?
No.
Probably not. America's low unemployment rate?
No.
America's insatiable demand for workers, with or without documents?
No.
Responsible for the private sector, farmers, ranchers, hiring of undocumented workers?
No, sir.
Let's just clarify, Ms. Acer. Is asylum legal?
Yes.
Is approaching our ports of entry and asking for asylum, is that legal?
Absolutely.
Is that legal under international law?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I just want to add, the majority party here voted to end the COVID-19 healthcare emergency. And in doing so, you voted to lift Title 42. What was left, Secretary Mayorkas has managed. He enlisted the help of our neighbors. No other time in the history of the U.S. and Mexico have we had such a great working relationship with Mexico and the others through Central and South America on the issue of the refugee crisis. So to say that Secretary Mayorkas has been derelict of his duty is misleading the American people and presenting misleading facts. Ms. Acer, is Mr. Mayorkas lying to the American people?
No, sir, I don't believe, to my knowledge, though I do disagree with him on his asylum ban. I think he is absolutely wrong.
I would probably disagree with him on that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and
Will the gentleman yield? Mr. Correa?
I yield, of course.
A few seconds. I just want to point out, Mr. Wolf, and all of our witnesses here, you may have a difference of opinion as to how the United States should process our asylum applicants. But the notion that that difference of a policy opinion would be the basis for a quote-unquote case closed that Secretary Mayorkas is violating his duty is preposterous, and it is not any basis for impeachment.
The
And I
gentleman's
yield back.
time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Higgins from Louisiana for his 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans watching this are listening to the commentary. You'd have to be living under a rock in America to not recognize the disintegration of our sovereignty at the southern border over the last 2 years. Got 6 million illegals processed in some manner into our country, 1.5 million known criminal runner gotaways, and the border law enforcement is so overwhelmed, estimates easily state that number is doubled of unknown and uncounted criminal runner gotaways. All told, you're talking about 9 million people rolling into our country since President Biden was inaugurated. Secretary Mayorkas' failure is difficult to calculate the impact upon our country, our entire country. Generational trauma the man has brought upon our country. My colleagues across the aisle this is your Baghdad Bob moment, when you witness clearly what the truth is, what everyone across the country recognizes as the disintegration of our southern border and horrific impact upon our country, and yet you drone on and on about how great things are. Blame everything on Trump. Good Lord, for years. And yes, the ranking member has a right to introduce a government study to the record, but the insinuation was that former Secretary Wolf served illegally. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that. Mr. Wolf, I know you very well. Did you serve honorably and legally as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, sir?
I believe I did. I was asked to serve as that acting secretary by the president. I took my oath seriously. I'm very proud of the way that I led the department. Lawyers can argue over the order of succession about the acting secretary before me, but I think what's clear is simply being confirmed doesn't make you capable of doing the job.
Thank you for your response, sir, and I apologize on behalf of the committee for that insinuation. I think it was ugly, it was tainted by agenda, and over the course of the next several months, perhaps they can develop a new script than just attacking the Trump administration, because we're going to expose what has happened to our country over the last 2 years. Mr. Scott, would you explain to the committee in America how Secretary Mayorkas has intentionally shifted migrant numbers through the CBP-1 app to promote the appearance of decreasing illegal crossings?
As we discussed earlier, the numbers that are being reported publicly they're selective. They've been focusing on the southwest border only, and we need to focus on total encounters, or what OFO calls as inadmissibles. If you go onto cbp.gov, their website, it's a nightmare, but you can slowly sort some of this stuff out.
Yes, sir. So to focus on the CBP-1 app, is it true that there's virtually no parameters disqualifying an applicant from applying for parole through the CBP-1 app?
That is my understanding.
That's my understanding as well. Mr. Wolf, in your opinion, sir, is the increased use of the CBP-1 app for parole application consistent with the app's original purpose?
No, not the original purpose.
Would you clarify that for America, please?
Again, it was for forwarders, it was for industry on how to facilitate that trade across the border. It was for boating licenses.
It was for legal commerce, to speed legal commerce through ports of entry, and yet now it's being used for undocumented, legally identified as inadmissible illegal migrants coming through our ports of entry using the CBP-1 app, and they're granted parole. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding of how it's currently being utilized.
And how would that be? Would you clarify how that's in violation of the law?
Well, again, that's not how the CBP-1 app was originally. And again, it's not how you allow individuals to come in, paroling them in. There's so many different exemptions of using that CBP-1 app. If you can't access it, they allow you into the country. And so it's another smoke and mirrors of how to bring in individuals, again, that have no legal right to be into the country, whether you parole them in or put them into the asylum system. The end result is all the same. So we can talk about the different ways. The end result is that they are released into American communities, and that is what's fueling this crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Magaziner for his
Thank you,
5 minutes
Chairman.
question from Rhode Island, by the way.
I have to say, I am getting sick and tired of House Republicans politicizing the Department of Homeland Security. There are common sense bipartisan actions that this committee could be taking up to improve security along the southern border. But instead of advancing smart policies to keep Americans safe, the Republicans have resorted to the type of political theater and Biden bashing that the American people are sick of. We know there are challenges at the border because poverty and political instability are causing millions of people to flee their home countries. But the notion that President Biden or Secretary Mayorkas are guilty of, quote, dereliction of duty are absurd. President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have been proactive in taking steps to protect our homeland. Here are the facts. April 27th, 2021, just 2 months after taking office, Secretary Mayorkas launched Operation Sentinel to combat criminal organizations smuggling migrants across the border. June 7th, 2021, Secretary Mayorkas launched Joint Task Force Alpha to crack down on trafficking groups in Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. November 2021, President Biden's infrastructure bill delivered $430 million to Customs and Border Protection, above previously budgeted levels for enhanced security at points of entry. Nearly every House Republican voted no. December 15th, 2021, President Biden signed Executive Order 14060, establishing the U.S. Council on Transnational Organized Crime with a focus on enhancing operational and intelligence capabilities to disrupt transnational crime organizations. In 2022, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats passed a Homeland Security funding measure that added 300 Border Patrol agents and 125 CBP officers. Every House Republican voted no because it had Joe Biden's name on it. In 2023, Secretary Mayorkas launched Operation Blue Lotus and Operation Four Horsemen to disrupt narcotics trafficking at and between points of entry. April 2023, the Biden Justice Department unsealed charges against 28 leaders of the Sinaloa cartel engaged in drug trafficking and other crimes. The list goes on and on. This is just a sample of the actions that the administration has taken to improve security on the border. But of course, you do not hear House Republicans talking about any of this because it doesn't fit their narrative. The only dereliction of duty here is House Republicans wasting time on political games instead of focusing on the real problems that we need to tackle to protect the homeland. Let's look again at the record. House Republicans introduced a measure to impeach Secretary Mayorkas 2 years ago when he had only been in office for 6 months. Politics. A leader of this committee in a closed-door fundraiser months ago announced that Republicans were going to impeach the secretary and said, quote, "Get the popcorn, it's going to be fun."
The gentleman yield. That's not what I said. So I want to correct the record. I never used the word impeachment. And I'm tired of this continual narrative falsely quoting me. I won't allow it, Mr. Magaziner.
Listen,
Continue your testimony.
I'll continue. Listen, another member of this committee, Ms. Green, just a few days ago, told the press that she voted on the debt ceiling bill only in exchange for a, quote, beautiful dessert, which is impeachment. So this has always been about politics and political games, and the most important fact is this. Since the expiration of President Trump's Title 42 policy, illegal border crossings are down 70%, and even when you include CBP One app appointments, which are legal, they're still down more than 60% since the expiration of Title 42. So there are a lot of things that we could be doing. Instead, we're wasting our time on theater. Now, Mr. Wolf, during your time running the Department of Homeland Security, were you ever impeached?
No.
No. During your time working at DHS and the Trump administration, did you prevent all unlawful entries into the United States?
We worked every day to do that.
But did you prevent all unlawful entries, yes or no?
No.
Okay. Well, I'm confused because I read Mr. Higgins' articles of impeachment that he filed a few days ago, and in short, they say that Secretary Mayorkas should be impeached because he failed to maintain operational control at the border, defined as the prevention of all illegal entries into the United States. So I don't understand, why didn't we impeach the DHS director under the Trump administration or any prior administration if that's the standard that warrants impeachment? Political theater, that's why. That's all this is, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I recognize Mr. Bishop from North Carolina.
I thank the chairman, and I think this is interesting, and it begins to ferret out what really is the key issue that this Congress needs to focus on in regards to the matter that's being testified to. And I appreciate the witnesses who are here. You're professional and dispassionate. I think almost no one is brazen enough anymore to deny that there's a border crisis created by the Biden administration, Secretary Mayorkas. Border Chief Ortiz admitted such on the way out the door. FEMA announced yesterday the distribution of more than $290 million in congressional funding to communities receiving migrants. You don't deploy FEMA resources when there isn't a crisis. But the issue here, and I agree, it shouldn't be political theater. It's not about policy differences, can't be. The issue here is vindicating the rule of law and the constitutional role and lawmaking power of Congress. Many claim the Trump indictment is about the rule of law. The ranking member says appropriately policy differences are of a different dimension, and I agree with that. And the appropriate response for Congress is different in each case. I don't even think, with all respect to the chairman, that our focus can be exactly on dereliction in the full sense articulated, because dereliction is willful or negligent. And what we need to focus on here is whether this is not a case of negligence. If it were, the implications would be different. The remedy would be different. Incompetence in administering a federal agency is maladministration, and the recourse falls to the people alone. But intentional sabotage of the rule of law is something entirely different. It is an affront to the separation of powers, to the institutional authority of the Congress under the Constitution, and it invites another remedy, and that is impeachment. Secretary Wolf, the ranking member, attacked actions by the Trump administration, but your statement, really elegant, 10 pages, covers a lot of ground. I urge people to look at it carefully. You point out that you were attacked for by the ranking member. These were exercises of authority specifically granted to Congress. Take migrant protection protocols, remain in Mexico. You cite 235B2C of the INA. In the case of an alien described in subparagraph A, that's somebody who would have right otherwise to asylum, claim of asylum, who is arriving on land from a foreign territory contiguous to the United States, the Attorney General may return that alien to that territory pending a proceeding under Section 1229A of this title. So that's exactly what you did. Whether somebody said you did it in the exact way or if you want to challenge how some, you were exercising an authority. Same thing with safe third country agreements under Section 208A2A, and I won't read all that. But here's what you point out, the violations of law, several of these found by federal district judges at this point in time, by the catch and release, ignores the mandate to detain or make them wait, an asylum applicant wait in Mexico. That's been judged by Judge Wetherill in Florida to be unlawful. The use of notices, what are they called, NTRs, Mr. Wolf?
Notices to report.
Notices to report. So you don't even have any formal commencement of removal proceedings, which a notice to appear would be, setting a date, even though you never get to them. They don't even do it. They just let them go with NTRs. The exercise of authority to adjudicate asylum by DHS officials, maybe Mr. Edlow, you may have pointed this out in your testimony, instead of in the Department of Justice where that power is reserved. An interior non-enforcement policy, Mr. Wolf, you pointed out the 100-day deportation freeze. Judge Tipton said that was illegal. Subsequent enforcement priorities established that exempt 99% from the threat of deportation. Secretary Mayorkas declaring that illegal presence alone is not grounds for removal. More than 1 million in the country subject to final removal orders, and they said they're not going to remove them. So I'm just going to leave my last minute to you, Mr. Wolf, but I see what we're talking about is intentional sabotage of the rule of law as set by Congress, and that's a different ballgame.
It is different. It's not just about whether or not illegal aliens can claim asylum, as was talked about here earlier. As you indicated, at least in my written testimony, there's 7 different instances where I believe the law is not being faithfully executed, to include the categorical parole, which was the last one there.
And I didn't get to that.
Which is at ports of entry, which is at the heart of all of this. You know, to have asylum needs to be an urgent humanitarian benefit or advantageous somehow to the United States. Simply paroling up to 360,000 individuals, which is what they are on track to do per year, violates the letter of the law. It's very clear.
Final point here is that it does fall to Congress, as well as these judges, fall to Congress through the impeachment power to decide whether the law has been intentionally flouted. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Swalwell from California.
I've heard the phrase rule of law and accusations that the Biden administration is sabotaging the rule of law. And the title of this hearing is Secretary Mayorkas' Dereliction of Duty on the Border Crisis. But I think in contrast to that, it's very interesting to me that the chief witness that the majority has called here, Mr. Wolf, was found on November 14, 2020 by a federal judge to, quote, not lawfully be serving as acting secretary. Not lawfully serving as acting secretary. So a lot of considerations and concerns from my colleague across the aisle about the rule of law, but the witness that they called served unlawfully is the acting secretary of Homeland Security, where an accusation of dereliction of duty is being made today. In addition to that, again, it's interesting that this is the chief witness that they've called today, because on September 17, 2020, the unlawfully serving acting secretary, Mr. Wolf, failed to honor his congressional subpoena. Didn't show up, skipped the hearing. So you have someone who's acting unlawfully and somebody who skips a congressional subpoena, and we're going to be lectured by the majority about a dereliction of duty of the current lawfully serving, Senate-confirmed Secretary of Homeland Security. I think that's interesting and an important perspective that we should have as we consider what's going on at our southern border. Ms. Acer, I want to speak with you just about what is going on at the southern border. And if you were to think about the migrants who are fleeing the Northern Triangle, who leave everything they know, their family, their livelihood, their culture, their homes, their community, their churches, and take the journey to America, do you believe that if we were to find a way as a global alliance, public-private partnerships, to help invest in those countries in their economic security and their physical security, and stand up and support a rule of law and go after corruption, that would reduce the number of people who came to the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, the reason that people are coming here to seek protection is because they're not being protected at home by their countries. There's a lot more that the United States can do to increase respect for human rights and to otherwise assist in making sure that conditions allow people who can stay safely in their home countries to do so.
And I understand, the counter to that will be, well, why would we invest money there if we have needs here? And there's no doubt we have needs here. But if we're going to be spending the money anyway, either enforcement of the border or taking care of people who come here, to me it just seems like a better holistic investment to try and work private sector, public sector, nonprofit, NGOs in those countries to stand up, as I said, economic and physical security. Also wanted to ask, what effect do you think it has, Ms. Acer, when my colleagues across the aisle, when Republicans say that we have open borders? And in fact, the title of the hearing today is Open Borders, Closed Case. Do you think if you are south of our border and you're looking for somewhere to go to keep your family safe and to find some livelihood, if you hear people falsely declaring that the border's open, do you think that makes you more or less likely to try and go to the United States because you think the border's open?
I don't know how much migrants actually listen to, to these hearings, but you're right in that I've heard Mexican officials say they wished that U.S. politicians would actually stop saying that the border was open because they thought that was really sending the wrong message. And sometimes disinformation, inaccurate information does get into Facebook groups that many migrants do follow.
Thank you, Ms. Acer. And I think the lesson here is that this issue is complicated. It involves human beings who are leaving everything. We've got our own struggles in the United States and clearly, cannot take on, a consistent flow from the southern border. But it needs solutions, not theater. And I'm afraid that my colleagues are interested in the crisis, but they're not interested in the solutions. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Jimenez from Florida for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Acer, you were quoted in the Baptist News Global referring to the end of Title 42, and you said that the dangers facing asylum seekers are more acute than they were years ago when the Trump administration started these policies, and these policies have contributed to a worsening of the conditions that face migrants and people seeking asylum. Did you make that statement?
I don't remember my exact words, but I probably did.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wolf, I believe, like my colleagues, that I don't believe that Mr. Mayorkas is incompetent. I think that he is derelict in his duty because I think everything that he's done is actually done on purpose. Do you share that view?
I do. This is by design.
Right. And so when, I've been an administrator, and when I've made mistakes and I listen to my folks and say, hey, why didn't that go the way that I wanted it to, I would listen and say and kind of change things. But Mr. Mayorkas kind of doubles down. And so when, in the first days of the Biden administration, a bunch of policies that the Trump administration had put in place in order to secure the border were overturned, and then things started to go south in a really big way. Do you know firsthand if people in the border, that Customs Border Patrol agents actually advised Mr. Mayorkas that, hey, you need to reverse these policies to stop this, this tidal wave that's coming into the United States?
Again, I wasn't there. It's my understanding that they did. Chief Scott was there in the Border Patrol advising the Biden administration, so I'm sure he can answer.
Well, Mr. Scott, can you answer that question?
Yeah, he was informed verbally, he was informed in writing, and I think it's important for everybody to understand everything fundamentally changed. When I worked for Secretary Wolf, we had team meetings. We were asked for our input. We were told over your career what works and what doesn't work. On January 20th, 2021, that all got shut off. DHS, the Secretary even went to the step of shutting down the integrated teams of career professionals that were brought into DHS ops to provide guidance. Our input was no longer solicited, and when my team and I gave it unsolicited, we were basically put in a box. They did not want to know what we had to say. They made it very clear, expedite processing and find new ways to let migrants into the U.S. That was the only agenda.
Exactly, which is on purpose, really circumventing U.S. law.
100% on purpose, scripted out, and the Secretary is not incompetent.
No, I know he's not incompetent. He's derelict, without a doubt. Mr. Wolf, back to you. When you had the Remain in Mexico policy, and people were told to remain in Mexico, and then they had their asylum hearings, what percentage of those that were seeking asylum were actually granted asylum?
Again, it would have been under that about 10 to 15%. The number that grant asylum has been holding for years now. About 80 to 85% do not qualify, and about 10 to 15% do qualify, and we saw that again under MPP as well.
All right, so those are the people that actually qualify to get into the United States, are granted, paroled into the United States, given some kind of legal status in the United States because they actually have a valid asylum claim. Now, when you get rid of that, and then you allow them to come into the United States, and then you don't, well, the law also says that if you're seeking your asylum, you're supposed to be detained until your hearing, correct?
Correct.
That's not happening right now, is it?
It is not.
Okay, so now you've got all the people who are coming into the United States, they're actually being granted, entry into the United States, so you're actually increasing the number of migrants entering the United States illegally, because they don't really have a valid asylum claim, by about 80%. Would you agree with that number?
That sounds about right.
Okay, and so we don't even know where they are. We don't know where some of them are being tracked, some of them are not being tracked. We don't know where 85,000 children are at this point. I consider that to be a dereliction of duty. Children 85,000, we don't know where they are? Did that ever happen under the Trump administration?
85,000? No, absolutely not. Again, you have an unaccompanied alien child crisis at the moment, 380,000. And so when if you happen to go to the baseball game tonight, that fills National Stadium almost 9 times. That's how many children that have come across that border that have no parent, have no guardian, that have been smuggled by these Mexican cartels at the behest, sometimes of their parents, because they know that if they get across that border, they will remain here in the United States. And it is a terrible journey. You are subjecting them to just horrific conditions, and it needs to end.
And the Democrats dare to call what happened during the Trump administration inhumane. My time is up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Goldman of New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our witnesses were asked whether what Secretary Mayorkas has done is intentional. Obviously, it's intentional. He's not doing things unintentionally. And he has testified before us, and he has acknowledged repeatedly that we are dealing with a very difficult situation at the border. I want to focus on, go back to what my colleague, Mr. Swalwell, was focusing on, which is my friend, Mr. Bishop's quote that there is an intentional sabotage of the rule of law. Now, we've heard a couple times today that the GAO and a federal court found that Mr. Wolf was acting unlawfully. To my understanding, that would be a violation of the rule of law. But let's focus a little bit on some policies and some efforts. Mr. Jimenez mentioned that there are children who cannot be found, which brings up, of course, the Trump administration family separation policy. Mr. Wolf, when you were the chief of staff to the Secretary of Homeland Security, isn't it true that you supported the family separation policy?
I was at the department from 2017 to the end of the administration.
Well, did you not, according to an Inspector General's report, urge the counselor to the Attorney General to implement the family separation policy, to increase prosecution of family unit parents and separate family units?
No, I don't believe. No.
Okay, well, I want to introduce into the record this Inspector General's report on family separation, which includes an email by you to Gene Hamilton, the counselor to the Attorney General.
So that email had a number of options
hold on.
for consideration. There was no direction. There was no direct.
So you're saying right here, right now, that you did not support the family separation policy.
That was not
Is that your
question.
testimony?
That was not your question.
I'm asking it right now. Is that your testimony?
We implemented a number of policies in the administration. I agreed with President Trump when he ended zero tolerance in June, I believe, of 2018.
Did you support the family separation policy?
Again, we had no family separation policy at the department.
Really? The department did not?
No, I'm happy to go through this.
All right,
the Attorney General
let's talk
announced
about
a zero tolerance policy that the department then implemented.
One sec. Let's talk about this, because the facts are that more than 5,000 children were forcibly separated from their parents at the border. And the reason is because the Department of Justice, for the first time, used Title 8, United States Code, Section 1325, which makes it a misdemeanor offense to charge anyone crossing without without papers, etc. That had never been used before, because the only point of that is to put parents who are charged with that in jail where they cannot actually be with their families. Now, a federal court in 2018 ended the family separation policy, which this court determined that there was, because the government's policy, quote, shocks the conscience, unquote, and violates the constitutional right to family integrity. There are still children who were separated at the border from their parents who have not been found because this zero tolerance policy, which ultimately ended up separating parents and children, did not create any mechanism to account for that separation in order to track the children. Now, that clearly, as a judge said, was a violation of the rule of law, an intentional sabotage of the rule of law. Let me go quickly to another one. According to a whistleblower complaint by the former head of the department's intelligence branch, Mr. Wolf ordered him to withhold an intelligence notification on Russian activities because it, quote, made the president look bad. The Inspector General, the Office of Inspector General investigated it and found that the department did not adequately follow its internal processes and policy standards when editing and disseminating